Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Megan, and welcome everybody to the session 10 of the American Climate Leadership Summit. Welcome, and especially welcome to Dr. Jennifer Wilcox and Dr. Julio Friedmann, our experts today on carbon capture and storage. I feel like this session has been especially designed for me because this is something that I really feel like I need to know more about. And we have the two probably most knowledgeable people on carbon capture, storage, and use in the United States with us here. 15 years ago, when I was getting into climate change, the holy grail was that we had to have affordable, renewable energy. And we worked on that. Prices have come down 95%. The fossil fuel industry today, including oil and natural gas, in spite of their great scale and political influence, is going bankrupt. Check, we've got that. 10 years ago, people said we needed affordable energy storage. They worked on a lot of different things, batteries, and now prices are down 90% plus. The most valuable car company in the world makes only battery cars, not gas cars. Check. We've got storage. I thought we were kind of done, but then about 5 years ago, I started hearing that we needed to take carbon out of the system. We needed to do carbon capture, storage, use. That's the new holy grail. Really? This is something, like I say, that we all need to know a lot more about. There are natural and industrial ways to reach net zero in the system, stop emitting, but wait, there's more. We need to take much of the carbon pollution that we put in the atmosphere and oceans back out. We need to. Can we do it? How can we do it? When can it be done? So we've got two of the most qualified experts in the world to tell us, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox and Dr. Julio Friedmann. Their bios are in the attendee guide and on the website, and you should feel free to use the Action Center and submit questions for them as we go through the discussion. And so we're going to start with just some framing here. Dr. Friedmann, you first, do we need to take carbon out of the system? Why do we need to take it out? How much? When? Give us some context.
Well, happy to. And thank you again to ecoAmerica, the ACLS, and you, Bob, for having. We have to do this fundamentally as a moral imperative. It's summed up nicely in the Pope's encyclical Laudate Si, which is not just about protecting the natural world, but serving those who can help themselves the least. And all the world's religions, all the world's governments place value on the natural world, and with good reason. I got into this conversation early as an earth scientist. I have the good fortune of actually having a close and immediate conversation with the natural world, and would spend months at a time out in the desert or out in the mountains or in the Arctic. And fundamentally, that means understanding the balances and how to fix what's out of kilter. This takes us to a core aspect of climate restoration and a core aspect of achieving any climate goal, which is net zero. The bottom line is, for any climate stabilization of any kind, you have to have net zero. What we're haggling over now is not do we need to do that, it's actually how fast do we do that. That's it. Like, are we going to have 1.5 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees of warming, 4 degrees of warming? They all need net zero to stabilize at that level. And net zero is a very strong constraint, and it's actually pretty straightforward. First, any emissions of any kind must be balanced by CO2 removal on emissions. Otherwise, it's not net zero. Second is that carbon that's taken from the Earth, that's taken from the geosphere, must be returned to the geosphere. And the primary reason why is because the Earth's actually in balance. Natural systems have an equal flux. So if you're adding carbon into that, you have to take it out. In that context, climate restoration requires about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 removal in order to get back to balance. And the fact that we need all of the above to do this is an understatement. We need more land, we need more energy, we need water, we need people, we need money. We need all these things if we're going to get the job done. And despite the remarkable progress we have made in solar and renewables and batteries, it is still the case that there are hard to abate sectors. There's the production of steel and cement and chemicals that represent about 1/4 of global emissions, and we have no pathway for deep decarbonization to them. About 10% of global emissions are just putting fertilizer on land to grow food. We don't have a solution to that. We actually need to balance those emissions in some way. And there are going to be some markets where other solutions will be faster and cheaper. And that's where, again, carbon capture and storage has a role. So in a combination of hard to abate sectors, a lot of work, and the need for climate restoration, we simply need to take every opportunity we can, every pathway we have. And to do so, I consider to be derelict. It's just not the work.
So no matter what, we're going to have to take carbon out of the system, no matter how quickly we switch or how much we switch to renewable energy, we've got to take carbon out.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is very clear about that. We've basically failed. We cannot stabilize the natural system without removing CO2 from the air and oceans.
Right. Jennifer, you literally wrote the first book on carbon capture in 2012 and haven't stopped then. What are our options? How do we do this?
Sure. So one thing to mention is carbon capture is a pretty broad topic. You can think about capturing CO2 at point sources like power plants, but you can also think about the direct removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so avoiding CO2 in the first place is always going to be cheaper and easier to do, but that's very different than taking the CO2 that's been accumulating in the atmosphere back out. And so if you look at the various approaches to carbon removal from the atmosphere, they span from natural solutions. So we know that even though we are emitting, as a global society on the order of about 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year, the oceans and the land take up roughly half of that. And so if we want to further remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we can accelerate those natural processes through natural solutions like more forests, or even figuring out agricultural ways that we can keep soil carbon in the earth. There's also rocks that are present in the Earth's surface that are high in alkalinity, and they react naturally with CO2 in the atmosphere. And there are ways that we could potentially speed that reactivity up and increase the drawdown of CO2 in the atmosphere. In addition, there's also something called bioenergy with carbon capture, which is another sector of carbon capture, where instead of fueling a power plant with fossil fuels, you fuel it with biomass, or a biomass that's mimicked to look like, say, pulverized coal, for instance. And so in doing that, if you retrofit those power plants with carbon capture, then you're inadvertently taking that CO2 back out of the atmosphere because you started with biomass to begin with for the energy resource. Finally, there's also engineered approaches in addition to the BECCS, which we call bioenergy with carbon capture, and even the accelerated weathering of rocks is an engineered approach as well. But we can use chemicals. And so things like, chemicals that allow, similar chemicals that we would use for point source capture from a power plant. But in this way, we can actually use them to react with CO2 from the atmosphere. It takes a lot more energy to do it because the CO2 is either 100 to 300 times more dilute in the atmosphere than it is from a point source, and requires just larger, contactors to interact with the CO2 in the atmosphere. So again, it's cheaper and easier to avoid carbon emissions in the first place. But as Dr. Friedmann pointed out, we're not doing it fast enough. We're not doing it at the scale we need to. And not just the IPCC, but I was also co-author on a report that was released in 2019 by the National Academy of Sciences of Engineering and Medicine that also said that in order to meet climate goals, we need to do carbon removal. We no longer have a choice. And in fact, we also, as a major conclusion to that report, quantified how much removal is going to be required in order to meet climate goals. And what we estimated is 10 gigatons per year of removal every year up to 2050. And then after 2050, up to 20 gigatons per year. So that's above and beyond the deep decarbonization that we actually need to do as well.
Okay, so there's two different kinds of carbon removal. One of them, as you say, point source. And that'll get us, like, let's say in 2020 or whatever given year, we'll be able to reduce emissions with renewable energy in different ways. And there'll still be some, no matter what, whether it's fertilizer or, and then we've got to reach net zero in a current period of time. And what I just heard is that's roughly about 10 gigatons a year. Then the second thing that we have to do is that we have to remove some of the accumulated carbon in the system. And Jennifer, what I just heard you say, that means like starting pretty soon, 10 gigatons a year, and then in a couple few decades, 20 gigatons a year. And that's how we're going to keep the planet to 2 degrees or whatever. So where are we on that path from where we are today to having those solutions to stop carbon pollution in the current period of time, and then to be able to take it on a really large scale and repair the system? And that's for both of you guys. Anybody jump in?
Go ahead, Jennifer. Why don't you start?
Okay. Well, the technology exists to do it today. It's absolutely technically feasible to do all of these approaches. And in fact, all of them exist on some scale, but too small of a scale. So for instance, the engineered solution that I mentioned, direct air capture, is on the thousands of tons of scale per year today. And so we need to increase that to gigatons by mid-century. So that means that we need to first increase by 1,000 times and then 10,000 times in order to get to what we need. In addition, one thing that we should mention is, again, there's no winner, there's no silver bullet. We need all of these approaches. But the thing about engineered solutions accelerating the weathering of rocks or direct air capture out of the atmosphere, these are approaches that allow the carbon to be removed on a short time scale. We can deploy them today. The chemistry is fast. And then the other aspect is that when we also, of course, need to do things like advanced storage carbon in soils and planting trees. But at some point, we're going to reach a saturation with those natural sources. And that's part of why that we can't just count on one strategy and one approach. But the reality is that all of the technologies exist today, and we just need to be able to have incentives, policy frameworks that help to deploy them.
Yeah, let me build, if I can, on what Dr. Wilcox just said. It is, Bob, I liked the framing at the beginning where you said it's like solar was 15 years ago. That's about right. 15 years ago was about when the investment tax credit began, and when about renewable portfolio standards became into law. Those mandates, those incentives were essential to get deployment. That was when Chinese industrial policy kicked in 2006. Same thing with the energy event. Ratchet down the costs and helped us get to where we are today. We know that we can do the same thing with all these technologies. Right now, we're leaving 85% of the exergy on the table. We can definitely drop the cost of conventional carbon capture to well below $30 a ton. And we can certainly drop the cost of these engineered solutions and these natural solutions to well below $100 a ton. But we got to get on with it. And the idea that this will just happen through wishing or market forces doesn't cover the range front. We simply need to build the technologies. We need to build the finance options. The last thing I'll say, people come to me all the time and say, isn't it just too expensive? Isn't it a matter of cost? And I always go, no, it is not a matter of cost. It is a matter of finance. People are ready to put money into it if they can get their money back. And already these technologies are cheaper than many, many options that we support with other policies. So it's really just a question of recognizing the work and valuing the money appropriately.
Wow. So one of the questions from the audience that says, if we take the carbon out of the atmosphere, isn't the ocean just going to release the carbon back in, everything that is stored? And can we take carbon out of the oceans?
Yep, so happy to start with this one. We have put 2 trillion tons of CO2 into the air, oceans, and soils. About 1.6 trillion of that is in the air and oceans, and about 900 billion is in the air and 600 or 700 billion is in the oceans, okay? That point is correct. If you pull CO2 out of the air, it comes out of the ocean. Let's be clear, we gotta do that. Like, ocean acidification is terrible, and the only way to fix it is to get the CO2 out of the oceans. So the math, the simple arithmetic is if you take 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 out of the air, that will also decarbonize the ocean at the same time. The last point is there are some pathways which do pull CO2 directly out of the ocean. Direct ocean capture, things that are called blue carbon, stuff like mangroves. We're working with an interesting company that wants to use kelp to pull CO2 out of the oceans. We're just getting started on that stuff. But again, I just see that as more of the same. It is the same component of the work.
And I would add to that too. One thing I think that people don't realize is how slow of a timescale the ocean circulation is in total. And so it takes about 1,000 years. If you have a particle, for instance, of ocean that's at the interface of air today, it would take 1,000 years for that particle to fully circulate throughout the ocean. And so what that means is that there are many parts of the ocean that have not seen the 410 ppm that we have today. In fact, there are parts of the ocean that still only think that the atmospheric CO2 concentration is 270. And so if the oceans stand a chance, then we actually need to do even more, removal of CO2 from the atmosphere in order to reduce the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere that exists today. The other thing that I'll mention is there are also, there's active work being done in direct CO2 separation from the oceans, the ones that Dr. Friedmann discussed, but also other approaches, because the CO2 concentration in the ocean is about a factor of 10 greater than it is from the atmosphere. So the approaches might actually be cost effective. You do have to process a lot of water to do that, which is why things like kelp are interesting for accelerating the CO2 uptake.
The sounds, when you start using like the trillions of tons, it sounds like very big numbers. It sounds like a lot of carbon that we've got to take out. What the heck do we do with it? Do we know what to do with it?
Yeah, Dr. Wilcox already sort of touched on that, but I pointed to that at my earlier comments. Fundamentally, it's got to go back. The best place to put fossil carbon is back in the geosystem, back in the geosphere. And that's the way to keep it out of the air and oceans. We know that we can put well over 200 trillion tons of CO2 into geological storage. About 10 to 20 trillion of that's just conventional geological storage. We're beginning to move into more unconventional stuff like basalts and mineralizations, which Dr. Wilcox mentioned. But the Earth can take it. That's not the rate limiting step. The rate limiting step is for us to get our act together and tie our shoes and bring it back into the geosphere. And we, to be clear, we know how to do that. We've been putting CO2 underground at the tens of millions of tons scale since the 70s.
Really? And how have we been doing it? Because that
equals zero, and the number of people hurt equals zero. So this is something we can do and have been doing.
Yeah.
All right, this is a bonus question. We have one of the members of the audience says, the ability of my head to absorb all this science has just reached its limit. I'm a pastor, not a scientist. How do I preach about this to my congregation?
If I could start, one of the greatest oceanographers of all time was Walter Munk. And Walter was invited to the first papal meeting on this stuff with the Laudate Si encyclicals. And leaving the meeting, he was asked by a friend, Andy Revkin, Walter, what is it going to take us to do? How are we going to get there? And Walter's response is, it's going to take an unprecedented act of love and generosity. That's really what this is about. Because fundamentally, it means helping people who can't help themselves. It means about spending money now as a moral obligation to future generations. It's about caring about your neighbor. It's about caring about nature. It's not actually that complicated. The thing that I want to leave your pastor with here as a thought is that the most important thing is to avoid magical thinking. To believe that there is one and only one way to lose weight and that one way is correct. Like, no, like it's an all hands on deck thing. Everybody has work and everybody gets to chip in. And the most important things we can do is elect people who care about the issues. Dr. Wilcox, to you.
Sure. That's a hard one to follow. That was good. Thank you. No, I think the important part is really thinking about sustainability in terms of a long-term goal. When we talk about where to put all of this CO2 and back into the geosphere and what that means, it means putting it back into the pore spaces of rock deep in the earth, which is where the oil and gas came from to begin with. And the reason why we've been putting CO2 in the oil in these rocks since the 70s is because we've actually been using it in the wrong way. We've been using it to enhance the recovery of fossil fuels. But it's through that path that we understand those rocks really well. And through that, we've trained a lot of people to understand how things work in the subsurface. And I think that, you know, a lot of times what happens in this field is that we kind of point our finger towards some of these industries that are like the bad guys. And I think that's the wrong way to do it. In fact, those folks have been doing it for many, many decades, blowing oil and gas out, but it's that same group of people that are going to help us solve this problem because they have all the expertise, they have all the labor force, and we need to work alongside those groups in order to put the carbon flows back into the earth where they first came. And that's really the way we're going to get to net zero, because all the CO2 that's accumulated in the atmosphere needs to go back, and most of that's from coal and oil and gas.
So I still don't have a clear path in my mind forward. Maybe let's put it in monetary terms. How much does it cost right now to take a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere? What is it going to cost in 10 years? What does it need to cost? You know, a lot of people tell us that, you know, we got less than 10 years left. We got to make major progress. And Jennifer, you just said 2040, 10 gigatons a year. You know, let's talk about it in monetary terms. Where are we going with that?
So let me give you a couple of numbers to help frame the discussion. And this is one of the things that's interesting is this stuff we're talking about is the only thing that is typically counted as dollars per ton, right? And that's the cost of unit of measure in this, dollars per ton of CO2, okay? So let me give you some other numbers. These were numbers compiled by President Obama's former head of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jim Stock, and he published a paper in 2018 with this information. The current subsidies for electric vehicles are between $400 and $2,700 a ton. Current ethanol policy is between $200 and $500 a ton. Solar subsidies today are between $50 and $300 a ton. We already pay enormous amounts of money for things, and the reason why is because we think it's a good idea, right? So in this context, capturing carbon dioxide from a steel mill is on the order of $80 or $100 a ton. It seems like a lot of money, but it's actually cheaper than many other things do. Wind production tax credit, between $60 and $120 a ton, it's basically the same range. To capture CO2 from the air, we're talking maybe today, it's about $600 a ton. We think that by 2025, maybe it'll be, I don't know, $200, $250 a ton. That is already cheaper than sustainable aviation fuel using the same measure. And we're already paying basically $400 a ton or even $1,300 a ton for sustainable aviation fuel. So like I said, it's not about cost, it's about finance. Mm-hmm. How do you get the money to the right people to do the right thing? And there is no expert in the world better at how fast and cheap we're going to make this than Dr. Wilcox. She literally wrote the book and is writing the book again on the cost savings.
Yeah, I was going to say those costs that you know Dr. Friedmann mentioned about coming down with direct air capture, it's possible, but only if we really deploy and then learn by doing. So one thing that that you asked, Bob, was how do we 10 gigatons per year by 2050? That just sounds overwhelming. And how much is that going to cost? So that was actually one of the results of our work from the Academy of Sciences study from 2019, where we actually quantified that to get to 10 gigatons of removal, the technology exists today at less than $100 per ton of CO2. And so, and that's a distribution. Some things like planting trees and some of the agricultural practices can be less than $50 a ton and downwards. But some of the other approaches like bioenergy, retrofitted with carbon capture and storage, are somewhere between 50 and 100. So it's a distribution of costs. The technologies exist today, and those are pretty, compared to some of the things that Dr. Friedmann threw out, those are pretty low numbers. Now, $600 a ton for direct air capture, again, if we can just make more of these projects reality, like 1,000 times what we're doing today at a minimum to get going, then we will have those lower costs realized, and so that's why in our Academy of Sciences study, we actually felt good about increasing to 20 gigatons of CO2 removal after mid-century, because the idea is that those expensive things today won't be expensive, provided that we deploy them today.
Well, with batteries and with the renewables, the cost has come down astonishingly. I mean, it's just gone from a whole lot to small single-digit percentages of what it was 10 or 20 years ago. Is there any chance that something like that can happen with carbon capture and storage or use?
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing in the physics or chemistry or engineering that stops that. It's important to realize, though, that we now have countries banning internal combustion engines. We have people dumping tens of billions of dollars into electric vehicles, and we're still at like less than 1% of global market penetration. That's with Chinese government mandates. That's with big industrial incentives. Like, it is hard to get deep decarbonization with vehicles, and vehicles are only 6% of global emissions. So we got a lot of work to do, and the punchline is we can do it. We know the recipe. The recipe is you give money to engineers and innovators, you make market aligning policies, you put a bunch of money into it and build a bunch of stuff. That's the recipe. That's what we did for batteries. That's what we did for wind. That's what we did for solar. That's what we did for LEDs. We can do this again.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left. And so what would you say to the audience about that they could contribute to? How could they contribute to getting carbon out of the system and furthering this method of saving the planet? What can people do?
Well, I can add to that. I would say that I think that people, the best thing they can do is really be open-minded and not get anchored in on that one solution is going to save us, or even that technology is going to save us. We have the technology, but in the absence of policy, we can't deploy at the scale that we need to. And so, but the other piece to think about, and I think this is something that everybody can do, is just be open-minded, and be open-minded that it's going to take a lot of different approaches, and that not one of them is going to be a winner. And to be a winner and to meet the climate goals, we need everything.
Dr.
Right.
Friedmann.
Absolutely. Well, to build on that, I wrote a piece recently on the fact that we need a lot of humility going into this. Like, we got to understand just how hard this is. We need to match our ambition with humility, and we need to match our humility with ambition. Otherwise, we're just not going to get there. And what can people do? They need to surrender magical thinking. They need to be open-minded and broad. And really, what they need to do is what's the best way to say this? They need to educate themselves a little more. Do some arithmetic. It's actually pretty easy. And when you get your head in the arithmetic, you go, oh, I guess we're going to need a bigger boat.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens here. With the earlier technologies in solving climate change, there has been huge economic incentives. It has been a free rider problem. It has been, some nations doing more, parts of the world doing more or less than others. And, the path forward in those things seems to be fairly well developed. The UN, what can America do? What can we as individuals do? How does the globe come together to take it out at a scale that we need to do it? And Dr. Friedmann, your thing about finance, seems to be very fundamental to that. If we can get the cost down and get returns, put a price on carbon, that might help. But
well, and it's not all hair, shirt, and eat your peas either. There are opportunities for wealth creation. There's opportunities for sustainable development. There's opportunities for export and for growth. Like the stuff that the same way there is with LEDs and solar and batteries, you can do the same thing here. And some of the poor nations in the global south will have new economies that they can harness with these new approaches.
Okay, last really quick question for both of you. If somebody wants to learn more about this, where do they go? What's the best source for civilians to understand and learn about this?
Well, one thing I'll say is that there's a group of about 30 or 40 of us that are writing a primer on this that's going to hopefully be released this fall. And that will be a fantastic document for anybody to go to, for a source to everybody to get on the same page. In the meantime, though, I'll say I'm also a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, and you can go to their website and there's a wealth of information associated with these topics there as well.
Yep, the World Resource Institute has been a real leader on this topic, and they recently written a set of papers on this for lay audiences. I would also encourage you to go to the Global CCS Institute based in Australia. They have extraordinarily good websites on all this stuff.
Great. Well, Dr. Wilcox, Dr. Friedmann, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with all of us, and Godspeed with your work, really.
Oh, it was a treat. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you again to ecoAmerica.
Okay.
Thank you very much.